The hum of airport activity faded into the background as Alicia Brooks stepped confidently onto the jet bridge, her designer briefcase swaying lightly with each stride. She moved with the grace of someone who belonged wherever she was, though that hadn't always been the case. Today was different. Today she was savoring the quiet satisfaction of her latest triumph, a seven-figure deal that, years ago, would have felt impossible. At only 32, Alicia had spent her life mastering the art of fitting into spaces where people rarely expected to see her. And the victory she carried felt like vindication against every door she'd once struggled to open. Her fingers brushed the smooth, tailored fabric of her navy suit as she made her way down the narrow passageway. This moment, this flight, represented more than a comfortable seat. It was a quiet reward for years of backbreaking work and countless sacrifices. In her earlier days, first class was something she'd only dreamed of. Back then, she'd flown in cramped economy seats, balancing her laptop on her knees as she typed up business plans into the late hours. But those days were behind her, at least for now. Now, she moved forward with a confidence that was earned, a sense of ownership over a life she had built from the ground up. As she reached her seat, 2A, Alicia noticed the subtle shift around her. It was a feeling she'd grown used to over the years. Quick glances cast her way, eyebrows slightly raised, smartphone screens suddenly demanding urgent attention. She'd seen it in boardrooms, restaurants, conferences, a symphony of subtle discomfort that played in spaces where she wasn't expected. But Alicia didn't flinch. She took her place in the plush, cream-colored seat, smoothly storing her briefcase above and allowing herself to sink into the soft leather with a rare moment of relaxation. She'd earned this comfort, every inch of it. For a moment, Alicia closed her eyes, letting herself feel the satisfaction she rarely allowed herself to indulge in. Behind her success were long, sleepless nights, and beneath her calm exterior lay the memories of every small victory that had brought her here. She thought of the mentors who'd encouraged her, the doors that had finally opened after years of knocking, and the support of her parents, who had sacrificed so much, even mortgaging their home to help fund her early dreams. Their unwavering belief in her had carried her through the hardest times, through the doubts and the endless demands of her business. She owed them so much, and today felt like a chance to honor all they had given her. The first-class cabin smelled faintly of leather and a hint of lavender perfume, a far cry from the recycled air and cramped quarters she'd endured during her company's early days. Now, she could finally lean back and enjoy a moment of peace. She opened her tablet, intending to glance over the details of the day's contract. But as her hand brushed the screen, she sensed something else, the unmistakable prickling of unwanted attention. Across the aisle, a man in a crisp charcoal suit was watching her, his salt and pepper hair styled with meticulous care, his Italian leather shoes shining beneath the cabin lights. Though he was in conversation with his seatmate, his eyes darted to Alicia with a look she recognized too well, a mixture of surprise and quiet disapproval. His voice, pitched just loud enough to be heard, carried a note of irritation as he remarked, "It used to be that the boarding process was more selective." Alicia's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. Years of navigating hostile boardrooms and dismissive investors had taught her the power of silence, the strength in refusing to be provoked. As he continued to murmur to his companion, her mind shifted from her plans and accomplishments to this moment, weighing possible responses with the calm precision of someone who had faced this kind of scrutiny many times before. Beneath her composed exterior, a flicker of indignation ignited, not from shame, but from a place of deeply rooted pride. He continued, casting a disdainful glance her way. "I do hope everyone's in their proper place," he muttered, his words heavy with implication. Alicia took a slow, measured breath. Her mother's voice came back to her, a phrase she had whispered like a prayer through Alicia's childhood. "Your presence is purpose enough." Those words had carried her through countless moments of doubt, reminding her that she didn't need to justify her place to anyone. She opened her eyes, fixing them back on her tablet, her fingers sliding across the screen with practiced elegance. But her focus now sharpened on the scene unfolding around her. Passengers nearby had noticed the exchange. A few exchanged glances, some with confusion, others with a hint of curiosity. The flight attendant paused by Alicia's seat, her practiced smile faltering slightly as she observed the tension. Alicia met her gaze briefly, a quiet look of understanding passing between them. The attendant nodded, moving on with a renewed sense of purpose, though the charged atmosphere lingered, crackling beneath the surface like the stillness before a storm. Alicia didn't need to raise her voice or argue to claim her space. She knew the strength of her achievements, the worth she had proven time and again. So, she remained still, the calm in the center of the gathering storm, her silence a deliberate choice. This seat, this moment was hers, and she wouldn't allow anyone to question that. She was where she belonged, and she would make sure that every person in this cabin knew it, not through anger or defense, but through the simple, undeniable truth of her presence. Alicia felt the tension thickening around her like a dense fog. The man across the aisle, the one in the charcoal suit, continued to steal glances her way, his eyes narrowing with each look, as if her very presence in first class offended him. His annoyance simmered just beneath the surface, spilling over in barely concealed mutters and pointed looks. Alicia could feel his eyes scanning her, his mind likely working through the endless assumptions that she had encountered too many times before. The flight attendant returned, moving through the aisle with a professional poise that belied her own awareness of the atmosphere. Alicia noticed how her eyes flicked from the man in the charcoal suit back to her, a subtle question in her gaze. But Alicia gave her a small, reassuring nod, letting her know she was fine, that this wasn't the first time she'd faced this sort of scrutiny, and it wouldn't be the last. "Excuse me, miss." The man's voice cut through the cabin, directed not at Alicia, but at the flight attendant who was now within earshot. His tone was smooth, polished, carrying the unmistakable confidence of someone used to being obeyed. He made a small, dismissive gesture toward Alicia, as though she were merely a nuisance to be dealt with. "I'm concerned there may be a seating error here," he said, his voice louder now, enough to turn a few heads. "Are we certain everyone is where they should be?" Alicia's fingers tightened on her tablet. She kept her eyes on the screen, but she could feel her pulse quickening, the indignation rising as a quiet fire within her. She had no intention of backing down, but years of experience had taught her the value of patience. Moments like this weren't about immediate reaction, they were about finding the right moment to make an impact. A lesson she'd learned through countless boardroom battles. The flight attendant hesitated, looking between Alicia and the man, her expression carefully blank. "Yes, sir. All passengers are in their assigned seats," she replied politely, her tone firm but deferential. But the man didn't seem satisfied. He leaned back in his seat, casting a sidelong glance at Alicia, his lips pulling into a faint smirk. "I see. I just wasn't aware we'd lowered the standards of first class to such an extent," he murmured, his words thick with condescension. This time, Alicia couldn't ignore him. She lifted her head, locking eyes with him across the aisle. She met his gaze with a calm steadiness, the kind she used when facing off with skeptical investors who didn't expect her to have answers, until she stunned them with her expertise. "Is there something you'd like to say to me directly?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, a hint of steel beneath her words. The man's expression shifted, a flash of surprise quickly replaced by a smug smile. "Oh, no," he replied, leaning back in his seat as if to dismiss her. "Just making an observation. First class isn't exactly what it used to be." Around them, passengers were beginning to pay attention, their quiet conversations dwindling as they caught on to the tension. A young woman in business attire across the aisle looked at Alicia with a mix of admiration and concern, while an older couple too rose back, exchanged disapproving glances in the man's direction. Alicia could feel the weight of their stares, both sympathetic and curious, and it fueled the steady resolve building within her. She'd spent her career fighting for a place in rooms that hadn't expected her. She'd faced down condescending executives, proved herself to skeptical clients, and built her company from the ground up, all while dealing with the very assumptions this man now held. The memories of her journey rushed back, late nights working tirelessly on her business, the sacrifices her family had made to support her dream, the obstacles she'd overcome simply to be here. This man's words were only one more small hurdle in a path filled with far greater challenges. But this time, she wasn't just going to endure it silently. The flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, looked to Alicia with an uncertain glance, as if searching for permission to step away. Alicia offered her a small nod, signaling that she could leave, that this was a moment Alicia could handle on her own. Turning fully to face the man, Alicia let a small, calm smile cross her lips. "I'm not sure what standards you're referring to, but I've spent years earning this seat. Perhaps you might consider that I belong here just as much as anyone else." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, his composure slipped, revealing a hint of discomfort. He opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to reconsider, his expression twisting with barely concealed frustration. The confidence he wore so easily only minutes ago now wavered, and Alicia could see that he was searching for a response that would allow him to regain control of the situation. But she was done with letting others dictate her space. She turned her attention back to her tablet, a quiet dismissal, and let her silence serve as the final word. Around them, a shift rippled through the cabin. The passengers who had been watching now settled back into their seats, some nodding approvingly in her direction, others shooting reproachful looks at the man. Alicia felt the weight of their support, a silent affirmation that, even if they hadn't spoken, they understood the significance of this moment. As the flight attendant passed by again, she offered Alicia a small, grateful smile, a look that spoke volumes. Alicia returned the smile, feeling the quiet satisfaction that came not only from standing her ground, but from knowing she had changed something, however small, in the minds of those watching. In that moment, Alicia knew that this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about every space she had fought to occupy, every room she had entered where people doubted her right to be there. And with each passing second, she grew more certain that her presence was a victory in itself, one that no one could take away. The tension in the cabin thickened like a storm gathering force, each exchange sharpening the air until it felt charged with something unsaid but undeniable. Alicia kept her eyes on her tablet, scrolling through business reports, but her senses were attuned to every small movement around her, the rustling of newspapers, the muffled coughs, the way heads subtly turned in her direction, curiosity and judgment mingling in every glance. And across the aisle, the man in the charcoal suit shifted in his seat, his frustration nearly palpable. The words came out louder this time, and directed toward Alicia. "Are you quite certain this is your assigned seat?" His tone was laced with an arrogance that turned heads all the way down the cabin. Alicia took her time, letting his words hang in the air, absorbing every quiet murmur and shifting gaze around her. She placed her tablet neatly on her lap, her movements deliberate. Then, with a calmness that came from years of handling boardroom showdowns, she looked him directly in the eye. "Quite certain," she replied evenly. "I'm in 2A, first class, exactly where I'm supposed to be." The man's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before his smugness reassembled itself. Like armor, he refused to set down. He tilted his head, feigning polite curiosity. "Well, I suppose misunderstandings happen, though I must admit, first class isn't what it used to be." He said it lightly, with a forced air of humor, but Alicia could feel the bite behind his words, sharpened by years of subtle and not so subtle dismissals she'd faced. She'd spent her life hearing the undertones, the unspoken assumptions that people carried about who deserved to be where. This man didn't need to spell it out for her to understand exactly what he meant. Around them, passengers leaned in, openly watching now, and Alicia could feel their curiosity and sympathy shifting. The flight attendant returned, hovering uncertainly between Alicia and the man. Her expression wary, but professional. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice neutral, though her eyes flickered with unease as she looked between Alicia and the man in the suit. The man didn't miss a beat. "Oh, no problem at all," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure everyone nearby could hear. "I'm just concerned that some standards might be slipping." He paused, casting a quick glance at Alicia before turning back to the flight attendant. "Perhaps you could double-check the seating arrangement, just to be sure." Alicia felt the old heat of indignation flare up, but she kept her expression serene. She had learned long ago that anger wasn't her most powerful weapon, composure was. She lifted her boarding pass from her jacket pocket, turning it over in her hands. She knew it by heart. Seat 2A. First class. Fully paid. Miles accumulated from hundreds of flights and sleepless nights spent building her business. Meeting the man's gaze once more, she held up the boarding pass for him and everyone else to see. "I assure you, there's no mistake here," she said, her voice steady, carrying a note of finality. "I belong exactly where I am." The man blinked, taken aback, and a hush fell over the cabin. It was as though her words carried a weight that no one could brush off. She could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, as if for the first time he realized he was not in control of the situation. But he recovered quickly, his smirk turning into a sneer. "Well, you might be in the right seat," he said, leaning back with a casual shrug. "But I can't help but feel that first class has become quite accessible these days." Alicia held his gaze, letting his words roll over her without so much as a blink. She felt a strange calmness, a clarity that allowed her to see him not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity to make a point, not just to him, but to everyone in the cabin, to everyone who had ever doubted her right to claim her space. She took a slow, measured breath, her voice calm but filled with a quiet power as she spoke. "Accessible, perhaps, but it's earned every mile, every trip, every sleepless night. I paid for this seat with more than just money. I earned it with hard work, with sacrifices you likely can't imagine. And I belong here just as much as anyone else." The cabin seemed to hold its breath, each passenger frozen, caught between curiosity and admiration. Alicia's words cut through the air, her calm yet unwavering tone challenging not just this man's assumptions, but every unspoken bias that had ever stood in her way. The flight attendant looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration, her smile faint but warm. She glanced at the man in the suit, a silent warning that the matter was settled. He slumped back, eyes narrowing but saying nothing, his bravado stripped away, replaced by a simmering resentment that seemed to shrink him somehow. Alicia returned her boarding pass to her pocket, her movements graceful and deliberate. She could feel the weight of the stares around her, but this time, she welcomed them. She wanted people to see her, to understand that she was here, unmovable, and that no amount of condescension or prejudice would change that. As she settled back into her seat, she caught the eye of a young woman a few rows behind, her gaze filled with admiration and a hint of gratitude. The woman nodded, almost imperceptibly, a silent affirmation that resonated like a ripple through the cabin. Alicia felt a flicker of pride, not just for herself, but for everyone watching who saw her standing firm and knew, in that moment, that they could too. This wasn't just about a seat in first class. It was about presence, about showing up in places where people like her had been told they didn't belong, and about claiming her space without apology. And as Alicia returned her attention to her tablet, a small, satisfied smile crossed her lips. The man in the suit might not have learned his lesson yet, but she knew that everyone else had witnessed something powerful, something that would linger long after the plane touched down. The energy in the cabin had shifted, as if Alicia's words had swept away the tension and left a quiet, simmering respect in its place. She could feel it in the way passengers looked at her now, not with judgment or suspicion, but with a kind of admiration that seemed to ripple outward. Person by person, the man across the aisle had retreated into an uneasy silence, glancing her way from time to time, though he kept his eyes mostly downcast, his shoulders stiff with the weight of his own discomfort. Alicia returned to her tablet, but her focus drifted to the space around her, to the passengers who had silently watched the exchange. It wasn't just a moment of victory, it was a moment of truth. One that had peeled back a layer of assumptions and exposed something raw and real. The quiet now was different. It was thoughtful, reflective, as if everyone on that plane had felt a small but undeniable shift in perspective. A young man in business casual 2 rows up removed his AirPods, his attention fixed on Alicia. When she met his gaze, he gave her a small nod, his expression one of respect and solidarity. She acknowledged him with a gentle smile, a silent understanding passing between them. They had likely both known moments of being underestimated, of having to prove themselves in ways that others didn't. Across the aisle, the man in the charcoal suit was watching her again. His earlier arrogance softened into something more complex, a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. It was as though her words had unsettled something in him, stirred a conflict he couldn't ignore. For the first time, he seemed to truly see her, not just as someone occupying a seat, but as a person with a story, with strength and purpose. He shifted in his seat, his gaze dropping to his hands. And Alicia wondered if perhaps, somewhere beneath his carefully curated facade, there was room for change. But she wasn't here to focus on him. She was here for herself, for the path she had fought so hard to create, and for the people who had believed in her. She thought of her mother's words again. Your presence is purpose enough. Every barrier she had faced had led her here, to this seat, to this moment, and she wasn't about to let anyone diminish that. A voice beside her broke the silence. Miss Brooks. It was the flight attendant. Her expression softened, a quiet respect in her eyes. I wanted to check if there's anything you need. Anything at all. Alicia smiled, a warm and genuine smile that she hoped conveyed her gratitude. Thank you. I'm fine, really, but I appreciate it. The attendant nodded, lingering a moment, as if to say more, but then simply added, We're lucky to have you on board today. Her words held a weight that went beyond the usual customer service pleasantries. And Alicia knew she meant it. She could feel the shift in the woman's tone, the respect that came not just from her uniform, but from one person to another. As the attendant moved away, Alicia caught sight of a familiar face across the aisle, an older black woman. Her silver hair swept back with elegance, seated just a row behind the man in the charcoal suit. She wore a Chanel blazer and carried herself with a quiet dignity that drew people's eyes, though she appeared completely at ease, as if this setting was one she had mastered long ago. The woman's gaze met Alicia's, and there was a glimmer of warmth, an almost conspiratorial nod that spoke volumes. She leaned forward, her voice just loud enough for Alicia to hear. Well done, she said softly, a smile gracing her lips. You handled that beautifully. Alicia felt a spark of warmth spread through her, a kind of validation she hadn't expected. Thank you, she replied, keeping her voice low. But her smile matched the woman's. The woman's eyes sparkled with a lifetime of stories. And she leaned in slightly, as though sharing a secret. I've had my own run-ins with men like him, she said, tilting her head toward the man in the charcoal suit, who was now studiously examining his phone. They don't always realize they're not as important as they think they are. Alicia chuckled, the tension easing as they shared this moment of understanding. Seems like they never quite do, she agreed, her voice carrying a note of solidarity. The woman gave a small, approving nod. But every time we stand our ground, we remind them and ourselves exactly who we are. She extended her hand across the aisle. I'm Eleanor Washington. Alicia Brooks. They shook hands, and Alicia felt an unexpected surge of gratitude for this woman, a stranger who somehow felt like an ally. Tell me, Alicia, Eleanor said, settling back in her seat. How long did it take you to learn that your silence could be as powerful as your words? Alicia considered the question, thinking back on years of hard-earned lessons. Too long, she admitted, a wry smile on her lips. But I learned. Eleanor nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Good. You're a reminder of what's possible. People like him. She nodded subtly toward the man in the suit. Need to see us here. Claiming the space we've earned. As their conversation flowed, Alicia felt a growing sense of kinship with Eleanor, a bond that crossed generations and experiences. They exchanged stories of prejudice faced in boardrooms, of assumptions challenged and expectations defied. Eleanor recounted tales from her days as one of the first Black women to enter the corporate world, her journey through doors that had long been closed to people like her. She spoke of battles won and lost, of victories that had felt small but added up to something greater over time. For Alicia, this conversation was more than just a passing exchange. It was a reminder of the legacy she carried, of the women who had come before her and fought for the rights she now enjoyed. And, in that moment, she felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before, a commitment not just to herself, but to the path that she was helping to forge for others. As they spoke, Alicia noticed the man in the charcoal suit watching them out of the corner of his eye. His earlier confidence now replaced with a kind of hesitant curiosity. She could see that he was listening, even if he wasn't willing to admit it. Eleanor caught Alicia's glance and leaned in close, her voice a soft whisper. Even he can change, if he lets himself. Sometimes, people need a reminder that the world is bigger than the box they're used to living in. Alicia looked back at her, a spark of hope mingling with the resolve in her eyes. Maybe today, he'll get that reminder. Eleanor's smile was one of quiet pride. Maybe he will. And as Alicia settled back into her seat, she felt a new sense of peace, knowing that she was part of something bigger than herself, something that spanned generations and defied boundaries. She knew that no matter who questioned her place or doubted her worth, she had the strength of all those who had come before her, and all those who would come after. In that cabin, surrounded by curious eyes and quiet judgments, Alicia realized she had found her own place, not just in first class, but in a legacy of resilience and strength, one that no one could ever take from her. The soft murmur of conversation filled the cabin as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Alicia had returned to her tablet, but her mind kept drifting back to her exchange with Eleanor. The older woman's words had left a lingering warmth, a reminder of the strength that generations of women like them had cultivated against all odds. It was a quiet power, forged from countless battles, and Alicia felt it bolstering her as she settled into her seat, her presence as steady and unyielding as the airplane's course. Just as she began to lose herself in her work, she sensed movement from across the aisle. She looked up to find the man in the charcoal suit rising, his face clouded with an expression she hadn't expected to see, hesitation. His shoulders seemed to droop slightly under the weight of something, perhaps a realization. As he stepped cautiously into the aisle and approached her row, the shift in his demeanor was so marked that Alicia paused, her attention fixed on him as he stopped beside her. Clearing his throat, "Miss Brooks," he began, his voice quieter than before, almost tentative. She raised her eyebrows, waiting. The man glanced down, his expression uncharacteristically strained. For a moment, he seemed unsure of himself, as though the words he wanted to say were foreign on his tongue. "I wonder if I might have a word," he continued. His tone softened, nearly humble. The cabin around them stilled, passengers discreetly observing the moment, their gazes flickering between him and Alicia. Alicia tilted her head slightly, regarding him with a calm that was both a challenge and an invitation. "Of course," she replied evenly, her tone polite but controlled. The space between them felt charged, a place where change hovered, waiting to unfold. The man's eyes darted around as he composed himself. He took a breath, his hands awkwardly clasping in front of him. "I've been sitting here listening to your conversation with Ms. Washington," he said, his voice carrying an edge of vulnerability that Alicia hadn't expected.
"And well,
"It's made me think about my daughter. She's just finishing her MBA." He paused, his gaze drifting to the floor as if he were gathering his thoughts. Or perhaps his courage. "The truth is," he said slowly, "I've spent most of my life in corporate banking. 30 years of hiring decisions, promotion approvals, shaping department cultures. And listening to you both," his voice grew even quieter, tinged with the rawness of recent realization. "I'm beginning to understand how many talented people I might have overlooked. How many assumptions I've made without question." Alicia felt a spark of surprise, tempered by a quiet hope. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the tension of someone confronting truths he hadn't wanted to face. And as he spoke, she realized that this was a moment he had likely never experienced before, a chance to lay down the weight of long-held beliefs and open himself to something new. He swallowed, his gaze meeting hers directly, his voice roughened with emotion. "My behavior earlier wasn't just an insult to you. It was a reflection of a mindset that has probably damaged a lot more people than I'd care to admit, including my own daughter. I thought I was giving her a better world, but I see now that I've been part of the problem." The silence in the cabin deepened, each passenger holding their breath as if they,
too,
understood the significance of his words. Alicia regarded him thoughtfully, letting his admission settle between them. She could see the cost of his vulnerability, the courage it took to make such a public admission. She knew he hadn't been expecting this moment when he boarded the plane. Yet here he was, taking a step he had likely resisted for much of his life. Finally, Alicia nodded, her expression softening. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," he supplied, his voice barely above a whisper. "James Harrison." "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she said, her tone steady, neither triumphant nor harsh, but filled with a quiet recognition. "It takes courage to acknowledge something like this. And your daughter is lucky to have a father who's willing to learn and change." A shadow of relief crossed his face, his shoulders easing as though he had been carrying a weight he hadn't realized was there. "Thank you," he replied, his voice filled with sincerity. He turned, pausing as if there was more he wanted to say, but the words escaped him. With a small nod, he returned to his seat, the tension in his posture replaced with a subtle humility. Around them, the cabin was silent, but Alicia could feel the impact of what had just happened reverberating through the rows of seats. The young woman from earlier watched her with wide eyes, her admiration unmistakable. A middle-aged man across the aisle gave her a small, respectful nod. Even the flight attendant, who had been hovering nearby, seemed to radiate a quiet satisfaction, as though the exchange had somehow restored a sense of balance to the space they all shared. As the plane flew through steady clouds, Alicia felt a surge of gratitude, not for herself alone, but for Eleanor, for the women who had come before them, and for everyone who had ever struggled against unspoken judgments. This moment was for them,
too.
She caught Eleanor's eye, and they exchanged a look of understanding. This wasn't about victory, it was about progress. And as she settled back into her seat, she felt the weight of a legacy growing lighter, knowing that moments like these would pave the way for others who would follow. As the flight continued, a new atmosphere filled the cabin, one of quiet contemplation. Alicia sensed a subtle ripple effect moving through the rows. Passengers who had witnessed Mr. Harrison's apology seemed more thoughtful. Their expressions softened,
as though they, too,
were reconsidering things. For Alicia, it was a rare feeling, like watching the first sprouts emerge after planting seeds in difficult soil. Just as she began to relax, a young woman in a sleek business suit approached her row. She looked barely out of college, her blazer still carrying the stiff lines of recent graduation. Her expression was nervous but determined, as though she had wrestled with herself before deciding to step forward. "Excuse me, Ms. Brooks," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, but her eyes steady and earnest. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to say thank you. Watching you handle all of that with such grace, it meant a lot to me." Alicia smiled warmly, gesturing for the woman to take the empty seat beside her. "You're not bothering me at all. I'm glad you came over." The young woman eased into the seat, visibly relieved. "My name is Michelle Chen," she introduced herself. "I'm starting my first job at a tech firm next week.
And a well.
I'm the only woman of color on the team. And honestly, I've been nervous. I didn't know what to expect or how to navigate it." Alicia nodded, her smile encouraging. She recognized the mixture of hope and fear in Michelle's voice. It reminded her of her own first steps into corporate spaces where people looked at her as if she didn't belong. "It's completely normal to feel that way," she reassured Michelle. "When I was just starting out, I had the same nerves, the same fears. And the truth is, those feelings never entirely go away. But every time you show up, every time you stand your ground, you're changing the story for yourself and for everyone who comes after you." Michelle's eyes brightened with gratitude and understanding. "Watching you today, I don't think I'll ever forget it. You turned a confrontation into a lesson without even raising your voice. I could feel the power in the way you held your ground, and it made me think that maybe I can do the same." Alicia smiled and reached into her briefcase, retrieving one of her business cards. She handed it to Michelle, the light catching the embossed logo that represented so much of her journey.
"Here."
"My team hosts monthly mentorship calls for women in tech. We cover everything: navigating difficult workspaces, building confidence, tackling unconscious bias. You're welcome to join us anytime." Michelle took the card with trembling hands, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've read about you in articles, but seeing you in person, it's different. It makes it all feel possible." Alicia's heart swelled. She remembered all the times she'd questioned her own place, wondered if she was strong enough to keep pushing through the walls placed in front of her. And here was Michelle, facing her own doubts, yet daring to dream, to believe that there was a place for her at the table. "It is possible, Michelle," Alicia said softly. "And remember, you're not alone. There are so many of us, working in different industries, all creating change in our own ways. Every time you show up, every time you assert yourself, you're not just doing it for you. You're doing it for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." Michelle smiled, her shoulders straightening as a newfound confidence settled over her. "I'll remember that," she promised. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks." With a parting nod, Michelle returned to her seat, clutching Alicia's card as if it were a talisman. Alicia watched her go, feeling a warmth that spread deep within her. This was what it was all about, not just claiming her own space, but opening the doors a little wider for others to walk through. Across the aisle, Eleanor had been watching, a knowing smile on her face. "You're sowing seeds," she said, her voice low but filled with pride, "helping the next generation find their voice." Alicia nodded, meeting Eleanor's gaze with gratitude. "Just as you did for me," she replied. Eleanor chuckled softly. "It's a relay race,
My dear.
Each generation takes their turn, running their lap, smoothing the way for the next. Sometimes we run, sometimes we sprint, but we never stop moving forward." As their conversation continued, Alicia noticed another passenger approaching, a middle-aged woman in a conservative business suit. She looked hesitant, almost shy, as she leaned in close to Alicia. "I couldn't help overhearing," she began, her cheeks flushing. "I just wanted to say, thank you for everything you said. My daughter is just starting college, and I worry for her, about the world she's stepping into. But seeing you here today, it gives me hope." Alicia nodded, feeling the impact of her words and actions reverberate beyond her own experience, touching lives she hadn't even known were watching. "Thank you," she replied warmly. "I'm glad I could help in some way." The woman smiled, then pressed a small note into Alicia's hand before returning to her seat. Alicia unfolded it, her heart skipping a beat as she read the handwritten invitation inside. "Women's Leadership Conference, Keynote Speaker Invitation." She felt a surge of pride and purpose, understanding that her journey had brought her to this point, not just for herself, but to inspire,
To lead.
to lift others. As she tucked the invitation into her briefcase, she glanced over at Eleanor, who gave her an approving nod. "Looks like your work is just beginning," Eleanor observed with a smile. Alicia laughed softly. "Seems so." She felt a sense of renewal, of purpose expanding beyond herself. She had always known her journey was about more than just her own success.
But now,
More than ever, she felt the call to use her platform for change, to be the voice that she had once searched for herself. The flight attendant passed by, pausing briefly by Alicia's seat. Her smile was warm,
genuine.
a look of understanding that went beyond mere professionalism. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for making this flight memorable in ways that truly matter." Alicia nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She knew that this moment, this seemingly simple flight, had become a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who had shared in this journey. The seeds of change had been planted, and as she looked around the cabin, Alicia felt certain that they would grow. As the plane glided through the sky, the cabin had grown quiet, the hum of the engines mingling with a new sense of reflection among the passengers. Alicia glanced around, noticing how many people had softened, as if witnessing her exchange with Mr. Harrison and then with Michelle had left an unspoken impact. Heads nodded in her direction. Friendly eyes met hers, and she felt the presence of a community that she hadn't expected to find. Eleanor, seated across the aisle, leaned over and offered a wink. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" she murmured. "How one person standing up for herself can change the entire tone of a room." Alicia smiled, feeling the truth of Eleanor's words resonate within her. "I suppose it's a reminder that change doesn't always happen in grand gestures. Sometimes, it's a quiet shift, a single moment that makes people question what they think they know." Eleanor gave a knowing nod. "Exactly. And these ripples carry farther than we can see. You may not realize it yet, but you've started something here." Just as she spoke, another passenger approached. It was a young man, dressed in Silicon Valley casual jeans, a crisp shirt, and sneakers that probably cost more than most suits. He had been watching Alicia from across the aisle, a look of admiration mingled with curiosity on his face. "Ms. Brooks," he began, offering her a smile, "I hope I'm not intruding, but I just wanted to thank you for what you said earlier. I work in tech,
And
it's not always easy to find leaders who really understand the importance of inclusion. Your courage today, it's inspiring." Alicia inclined her head, feeling both gratitude and a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you. Inclusion isn't just a buzzword, it's a commitment. And it's on all of us to create environments where everyone feels like they belong." He nodded, a thoughtful look passing over his face. "You know, I attended a tech summit last year, and one of the keynote speakers was a woman who spoke about exactly that. She talked about the importance of inclusive UX design, about building tech that serves all communities." His eyes brightened with recognition. "Actually, I think that was you." Alicia laughed, delighted by the connection.
yes.
"That was me. Inclusive design is close to my heart. I believe technology has the power to connect us, to bridge gaps that society sometimes forgets. But that only happens when we build with everyone in mind." The young man looked thoughtful. "I want my company to follow that path. You've given me a lot to think about, and a lot to work toward." Alicia extended her hand, which he shook firmly. "We need more leaders like you, willing to look beyond the norm. If you ever want to continue the conversation, my team is always open to partnerships that push for inclusivity in tech." He smiled, his face alight with purpose. "Thank you, Ms. Brooks. I'll take you up on that." As he returned to his seat, Alicia noticed that the energy in the cabin had shifted yet again, this time with an air of possibility, as if everyone around her was reassessing their own roles in fostering change. She could feel it, the weight of the moment. The realization that the work she had poured herself into was reaching others, sparking ideas and stirring hearts in ways that went beyond business. As the flight attendant passed, she paused beside Alicia, holding out a bottle of water and leaning down to speak softly. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her eyes warm with genuine gratitude. "You've shown so many of us that dignity doesn't mean silence. That respect is earned by standing tall." Alicia took the bottle, offering the attendant a warm smile. "Thank you. And remember, each of us has the power to inspire change. Even small acts of kindness or courage, they add up." The flight attendant nodded, visibly moved. Before continuing down the aisle, Alicia watched her go, a sense of fulfillment settling over her. She had come onto this flight with nothing more than her business goals on her mind. Yet she was leaving it with the knowledge that she had created ripples that would carry far beyond this plane, touching lives in ways she hadn't anticipated. A voice came from beside her. "Each person you talk to, each moment you share, it's making a difference." It was Eleanor again, her voice filled with quiet pride. Alicia turned to meet the older woman's gaze, feeling the weight of her words, the unspoken bond that connected them as two women who had faced countless obstacles yet refused to yield. "Thank you, Eleanor," Alicia said softly, "for reminding me that none of us walks this path alone." Eleanor's smile was warm, filled with the wisdom of experience. "We're in this together, Alicia." One generation's journey becomes the next generation's foundation. Every step you take, every boundary you push, it strengthens the ground for others. Alicia nodded, her heart full. She knew that her journey was only beginning, that the work ahead of her would be challenging but rewarding. And as she looked around the cabin, at the faces of those who had witnessed her stand her ground,
She knew that they, too,
were part of this collective journey toward a world where everyone could feel they truly belonged. The plane continued on its path, and Alicia sat back, feeling the weight of possibility as it stretched before her like the sky. The future, she realized, was not just hers to shape, but theirs to create together, an intricate, interwoven tapestry of change and resilience, each thread adding strength to the fabric they all shared. As the plane began its descent, a quiet stillness settled over the cabin. But it was a different kind of stillness. Alicia sensed that this journey had left an impression on everyone, from the passengers who had quietly observed to those who had courageously engaged. Her interactions with Michelle, Eleanor, Mr. Harrison, and even the young tech professional had created a chain reaction, a reminder that change often starts with a single conversation, a single act of courage, and grows from there. Alicia leaned back, feeling the familiar weight of her phone in her pocket, buzzing with messages and emails awaiting her attention. But for once, the demands of work could wait.
right now.
She was relishing the moment, the satisfaction of knowing that today had been about far more than just herself. As the plane touched down with a gentle rumble, she felt a strange reluctance to leave the space they had all shared. It was as if the cabin had become a place of quiet transformation, a fleeting yet powerful pause from the world outside. Alicia glanced around, catching the warm, appreciative gazes of her fellow passengers.
Nods.
Smiles and small waves met her glance, each gesture a silent acknowledgement of the journey they'd taken together. Eleanor was one of the last to gather her things, taking her time with deliberate, graceful movements. She reached across the aisle, her hand outstretched, and Alicia grasped it warmly. "Thank you, Eleanor," Alicia said, her voice tinged with both gratitude and admiration. "For everything you shared." Eleanor's eyes sparkled. "It's been my pleasure, Alicia. And remember, you've started something here. Hold on to it. Nurture it. People are ready for change, even if they don't always realize it." They shared a look that was both hopeful and knowing, the kind of look that held within it the unspoken promise of future paths crossing again. With a final nod, Eleanor turned to exit the plane, her figure a portrait of dignity and resilience. As Alicia collected her briefcase, she found herself face to face with Mr. Harrison, who stood in the aisle waiting, his expression filled with the vulnerability of someone still navigating a new realization. He held his phone in his hand, the screen showing a picture of a young woman in a graduation cap and gown, beaming with pride. "This is my daughter," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I told her about you.
About today.
I want her to know that the world isn't just the one I grew up in, or the one I helped shape. It's changing, and people like you are helping lead the way." Alicia softened, placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison, for taking this step, for your daughter and for everyone who will follow." He nodded, a glimmer of newfound humility in his eyes. "I've got a lot to unlearn," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I want to be part of a world where she doesn't have to fight as hard as you did."
With that,
he took a steady breath, turning to disembark, leaving Alicia with the image of his daughter's bright smile. She could only hope that his journey, though long and challenging, would help make the world a little more welcoming for her. As Alicia finally stepped off the plane, the terminal stretched before her, bustling with travelers caught up in the race of their own lives, their own destinations. Yet something felt different as she walked through the concourse. There was a new purpose in her step, a resolve that had been reignited, one that would guide her through every meeting, every challenge, and every moment of doubt. Today had reminded her of the power of presence, the quiet force of holding her ground and speaking her truth, even when the world didn't expect it. She barely made it a few steps into the terminal before she heard her name. She turned to see the flight attendant,
Sarah,
hurrying after her, her face alight with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. "Ms. Brooks," Sarah said breathlessly, "I just wanted to thank you, again, for everything you did back there. You don't know how much it meant to all of us who were watching." Alicia smiled, moved by Sarah's sincerity. "Thank you,
Sarah."
Sometimes it takes all of us standing together to make a difference." Sarah nodded, her eyes misting. "Safe travels," she said. And then, with a small laugh, added, "Though I have a feeling you'll find fewer obstacles on your return flight." They shared a laugh, and as Sarah turned to head back to her duties, Alicia continued on, her heart lighter, her spirit stronger. She knew the work that awaited her, the challenges that would come.
But now,
More than ever, she felt ready for them. The connections she'd made, the lives she'd touched, they were all part of a legacy she was helping to build. A future that was becoming clearer with every step she took. As she moved through the airport, her phone vibrated with a new notification. She opened it to find a message from Michelle. "Thank you for today. You gave me the courage I needed. I'll see you at the mentorship call." Alicia's heart swelled. Today had been about so much more than a seat on a plane. It had been about claiming her space. Yes, but also about lifting others, helping them believe in their own worth and strength. She looked out at the expanse of the terminal and imagined the countless stories unfolding around her, some hopeful, some difficult, but all filled with the potential for change. Her journey was far from over. In fact, she felt as though it was just beginning, as if today had opened a new chapter, one filled with purpose and a vision for what could be.
she walked on,
Her heels clicking with renewed confidence against the polished floors, her path clear, her mind steady, and as she headed toward her next destination, she knew that whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the quiet, unshakable power she had rediscovered on this flight, a power rooted not only in her own accomplishments, but in the legacy of all those who had come before her, and in the future of all those who would follow.